have a seat this morning. If you were here with us last week, you know that we started asking this question: what is it that breaks your heart? What is it that breaks your heart? That's the question that we're asking as we're in this series, We Out Here. And before we jump in, I want you to just think about that. Like, what is it that breaks your heart? Did you think about that this week? Did you cry about it? Did you sit down and just weep because your heart is broken over this thing? Did you pray about it? Like, what did you do this week? And maybe this is the first time you're here and you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I get it. This is a weird way to start a message. But I just want to ask you, like, what is it that breaks your heart? Take a minute, 30 seconds, and just tell the person next to you, if you've thought about that, or if there is something that just comes to mind, share with them what it is that breaks your heart. Go ahead and do that now. It's cool to hear the whispers as we share the things that break our heart with the people next to us. I'm guessing whether you shared something or not, that there is something that does in fact break your heart, right? There's something that bothers you. There's something that gets to you, something that weighs on you. Maybe it's an injustice. Maybe it's a need. Maybe it's not a thing that's out there, but it's a person that's hurting, that breaks your heart, and you see the situation that they're in. Maybe it's somebody that's being abused. Maybe it's a group of people that are being abused. Maybe it's people that are being neglected. Maybe it's something else. My guess is, though, each and every one of us has something in life that bothers us, something in life that breaks our heart when we actually sit down and think about it. What is it that disturbs you, upsets you, makes your blood boil? If you don't know what your thing is today, that's totally fine. My encouragement to you would be to pray about that and to say, God, would you stir something up in me? Would you break my heart? And here's why. When our heart is broken, it reveals a calling for us to embrace, right? Like when the burden that we bear starts to really affect how we live, it's going to change how we live, right? The burden that you bear often reveals the calling that you will embrace in life. Let me say that again. The burden that you bear often reveals the calling that you'll embrace in life. And so asking this question, what is it that breaks your heart, is so important. Now here's the thing, like, you rarely know on the front end of something whether or not it's going to be really special or not, right? Like, you might step into something having no idea if it's going to turn out really, really good or really, really bad. Now, I could share a little story from my own life where I stepped into something and I was nervous to step into it, but I wasn't sure how it was going to go. Years ago, Colleen and I, we were living in Peoria, Illinois, and I've talked about Peoria a time or two if you've been here with us before. Most people think of Peoria as like the armpit of Illinois. Like, it's not the place that people want to go, right? Like, most people, they want to go to either like Chicago or like Missouri and St. Louis or Indiana. Like, you don't want to go to Peoria, but this is where we were. And Peoria, for those of you that don't know, it's a very diverse group of people. You have the urban city center, and then you got the farmers driving their tractors within 10 minutes. Like, you could drive through Peoria and not know that you drove through Peoria and then say, like, what was that weird place with the tall buildings in the middle of the cornfields that we just went through? And so Colleen and I, we were living in Peoria at the time. We were working in a downtown church, and it was a bilingual church. And so we had services that were both in English and in Spanish, and it was just an incredible place. But what I noticed is that our youth ministry was made up of all the white suburban kids, while the Spanish-speaking group of students, they weren't there. And being a bilingual church, I wanted to see our youth group reflect our community and reflect our church. And so I said, why are these students not here? What's going on? And I realized for a lot of our students that were bilingual and lived really close to the church, they just didn't have a way to get there. And so I felt this need to help them get there. And I looked, and at the time I had 4 seats in my car. Colleen had 4 seats in her car. And so together, Colleen and I started driving to some places that other people said, we're not going there. And we'd pick kids up and bring them to the church. And it was great. We got to meet all kinds of students. We met like Jose, and we met Jaden, and we met some other students. Jamia was one of Colleen's favorite students that she met. We met Michaela and Naomi, and we started meeting all these kids. And pretty soon, our cars were full. And we realized, there's more and more students that want to come. And so then we said, well, the church has a couple vans. And so we enlisted a couple other people to start driving around these big 12-passenger vans. And before you knew it, our youth ministry, which had started out when I got there as 12 white suburban kids, it had grown to a group of about 60 students. And 35 to 40 of those kids were kids that we were picking up with vans and vehicles week after week so that they could be a part of our community, so that our youth ministry would reflect the church and the community that we were a part of. I didn't know that it was going to be that successful when we jumped into it, right? I didn't know that we were going to meet tons of kids and have this new connection with our community. I didn't know it was going to be special. I didn't know what might happen. For all I knew, it could have flopped really, really terribly. But we saw the need. There was an opportunity that existed to help meet the need. And we said, hey, we're going to step into it. We're just going to go for it. And I think some of you today are in that spot. You've seen the need, you've recognized the need. Maybe that need has broken your heart and you want to do something, and you're sitting there just thinking I don't know what to do. You're on the front end of something really special potentially. And you're just sitting there thinking what should I do next? And today we're going to answer that question, hopefully, and give you some next steps. But before we get there, let me just fill you in on where we were last week so that way you're caught up and we're all going the same place at the same kind of speed. Last week, we've started this series called We Out Here. We're in the book of Nehemiah. If you've not read Nehemiah, if it's been a while since you've read Nehemiah, I would encourage you this week to open up a Bible. And if you don't have a Bible, we have some outside, and we love to get you one. We have them in English and Spanish. Or you can use an iPad or a phone and get the Bible app, and you can open up to Nehemiah and read through Nehemiah. But Nehemiah is this book of hurt and brokenheartedness, and Nehemiah, the cupbearer to the king, stepping out and doing something incredible. You might remember that we said in 587 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, the Babylonians, they attacked Jerusalem. They destroyed the city. They destroyed the temple. They took all the people captive and left the city in shambles. It was unrecognizable. And for decades, the Jews were prisoners, captives of the Babylonians, until one day they were released. Some of the Jews were released to go back to their homeland and to rebuild Jerusalem. And when they got there, they remembered how awful it was. There was no economic system. There wasn't even a wall. There was no leadership in place. And they had no hope. They were hopeless. Maybe they even felt like failures. Why did we leave that place to come back here? And now, 140 years after the destruction, a little bit of time since the Jews had gone back to Jerusalem, this ordinary guy, Nehemiah, a guy who he didn't have a position of status. He had a position of being a servant, the cupbearer to the king, the one that would taste the wine and taste the other drinks before giving them to the king. And if he turned over dead, the king would say, I'm not drinking that. This guy, Nehemiah, just an ordinary guy, not a pastor, not a priest, not a warrior, not a contractor. He wasn't even verified on Instagram. This was just a regular, ordinary dude. he heard about the plight of his people. He heard that they had returned home to Jerusalem and things were bad. And he was brokenhearted. Brokenhearted for his people, brokenhearted to learn about his city. And he didn't know what to do. And so last week we said that he sat down and wept. He cried. He allowed that brokenheartedness to move from his head to his heart, and he cried over it. And then he knelt down to pray. And we finished chapter 1 understanding that he knelt down 12 times. And after praying and crying, then he stood up and he began to act. He stood up and he said, you know what? Somebody's got to do something. If it's not going to be them, it's going to be me. I've got to do something. I can't just sit here and feel bad about what's going on. Like, I've got to step into this situation. I've got to be a part of the difference. I've got to be a part of the redemption story. And that brings us to this question today. How do I make a difference? Why don't you say that out loud right now? Like, say, how do I make a difference? That's the question, right? Like, we all want to answer this question. We all ask this question, or we say, like, what's my purpose? Maybe that's a different way of saying that question. And very honestly, it starts really, really simply. At least in theory, it starts simply, but it's hard at times. It starts by seeking God faithfully. If you're taking notes, like write that down. Like the things that we do to discover our purpose, or the way that we know what we can do to make a difference, begins with seeking God faithfully. I already mentioned that Nehemiah sat down and cried, and then he kneeled and prayed. And he prayed for 12 different times, right? He prayed before he did anything. He sought God before stepping into anything. He sought God before acting. He sought God and said, like, God, like, give me direction, give me guidance, give me the words. Give me what I need, God, so that I can stand up and act. And here's the timeline, very honestly. Like, he hears this news, right? His brothers in chapter 1, they came and they shared with him the news, and they shared about the destruction and how they'd returned and it was still destroyed, and the people were just suffering in Jerusalem now. And so he hears this news and he starts to pray, and Kislev is what it says. Kislev, for those of us today, and with like a normal like January through December calendar, Kislev falls somewhere in like November, December. And so Nehemiah starts praying in November or December, and it says that he prays until the month of Nisan. Not Toyota, but Nisan, right? Like, he prays for 4 months, it says, and he prays and he fasts for those 4 months. So he prays from Kislev to Nisan, and he's seeking God first. He's just spending time like asking God, like, what do I do? What does this look like? How do I make a difference? He doesn't just say like, hey God, like, I'm about to go and do something, I think. Like, could you just be with me? Right? Like this is a serious prayer. Like, it's a 4-month prayer. It's a lot of praying and fasting. And it's impossible to describe, but have you ever had one of those really hard conversations? You know, where like it's tricky, you don't know, like, how do I approach this person? Like, this might let them down, or it might make them angry, or something like that. Like, you can't really describe it, but you know what that feeling is. It starts to like bubble up inside. And this is where Nehemiah is. He's feeling this like thing inside him about, how do I approach the king? How do I approach the person that I'm serving as cupbearer? How do I approach them and ask that I go back to my people, that I help them? How do I have that hard conversation? And he's praying. He spends 4 months like asking God, how do I approach the king about this thing? And this is tricky because like the king is generally insulated from personal conversations like this, right? Like Nehemiah has this position where he actually interacts with the king. And so he can just say, hey king, by the way, you know, I'd like to be able to go back to my people and help them. But the king doesn't normally hear these things, and so he doesn't know how the king's going to react. And so it's this spot where he finds himself praying and fasting for 4 months, seeking God's direction and guidance. It says here in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1, I had not been sad in his presence before, meaning I had not been sad in the presence of the king. And so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you're not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. I like how the Message says it too. It says, why the long face? You know, like sometimes you're feeling something and you think like, oh, I'll just hide it. Like no one will know. You know if that's you, like, right? Like people will say, like, your face tells me exactly what you're feeling. Like, why the long face? Your face tells me so much. You're not sick, are you? Or are you depressed? That's the king asking him, like, what's going on with you? Like, I can see it on your face. I know you're not sick. Are you depressed? What is it that's inside of you that's causing this? What is it that you're feeling right now, right? And so the king, in verse 4, the king said to me, what is it you want? What is it you want, right? Like Nehemiah didn't have to go to the king and start the conversation. Like it just showed. The king says, what do you want? And then in that moment, he prayed again to the God of heaven, and I answered the king. I love this. Like Nehemiah, he spends 4 months praying and fasting. He knows God's voice. He knows what sitting in God's presence is like. And so in this moment where he's having this conversation now with the king, and the king says, like, what do you want? He doesn't say, hold on, I have to go back to my notebook and my journal and read like my conversations with God. Like, no, he says, like, hold on, like in his mind, I prayed right then and there in this moment so that I could answer the king. A lot of us, we don't spend that time with God. If we're being really honest with ourselves, like our prayers are more like, God, I've got this big project due for work, and the deadline happens to be in a couple hours. Like, could you help me out here? Or God, I've got a test tomorrow that I've yet to study for. Could you help me out? Like, could you be with me, right? Like that's not what this is. This is like a deep personal connection with God where he spent time with God. And so then in this moment, in this conversation with the king, he's able to send up a prayer and say, God, help me. And then he was able to answer the king. You know, when it comes to prayer, a lot of us don't treat prayer as this thing that like really makes a significant difference in life. A lot of us treat it like it's this little like trick for getting what we want. But let me tell you this, like when it comes to prayer, there is nothing too big for God's power, and there's nothing too small for God's heart, right? Like if it's a burden to you, if your heart is broken about something, it breaks God's heart as well. Recently, you might have heard that Nikki, one of our teaching team members, was able to go into a prison for the first time and start a prison ministry there. And I forget how many girls she had that came to the Bible study that she was leading that first time, but she was able to come out with like all kinds of prayers that they have. And it's cool if you want to be able to pray for the girls and pray for Nikki and that ministry as it starts to really take off in the prison. You can sign up for that, and you can go on our website and look for like a serve group, and then you'll see prison ministry, and you can sign up there, and Nikki will get you emails and notifications about that ministry and how you can pray for it. But here's the deal. If you don't know, Nikki's got a pretty long rap sheet, and she's very honest about it. Like she sold drugs, she did a lot of things that she was not proud of, and she ended up in prison. And for somebody that ended up in prison to now go back into a prison And to lead a Bible study in a prison, that's not normal. Like, that doesn't just happen. Like, once you're out of prison, like, they don't say, like, hey, come on back in and, like, talk to the girls that are in here. Like this is not a normal, average thing. And so Nikki first said, like, a year ago, like, I really feel like God is, like, putting it on my heart to start a prison ministry, to go back into the prisons where maybe I've been and to reach some girls for Jesus that just need some hope in their life. Maybe they need some healing in their life. And the reality was that Nikki shared with me is like, I don't know how to start that. I don't know what that looks like. I don't even know if they're going to let me back in on the other side because of the things in my past. And so Nikki didn't say like, hey, we're just going to like make a plan and run with it. No, she said, let's start praying about it. Right? Because there's nothing too big for God's power and nothing too small for God's heart. And it broke Nikki's heart to know that there are girls that need hope and healing in prison. And no doubt it breaks God's heart as well. And so over the last several months, we've prayed about that. Some of you have prayed about that. And just a week and a half ago now, Nikki was able to go in and to share the good news of Jesus with some girls that need help and healing and hope in their life. Like prayer opens doors. Maybe it starts as a crack under a window, but prayer moves mountains. Like we say here that we're going to pray boldly, and we really mean that. And starting a prison ministry in a prison with somebody that has gotten out of prison is a bold thing to pray, but God moved mountains to make that possible. And I know that if there's things on your heart and you start really praying about those things yourself, God's going to move those mountains as well to make that thing possible. I love what Craig Rochelle says. I heard this a few years ago, but it's just one of those things that like, it kind of gets to you. Craig Rochelle says, if prayer isn't necessary to accomplish your vision, right? If you can do it on your own, you're not thinking big enough. Right? Like if prayer isn't necessary to do the things that you feel like you're supposed to do, that you feel like God has like led you into, if prayer is not required for this thing because you know how to do everything, you know how to fund everything, you know how to plan and strategize and put together everything, like if that's where you are, then you're not thinking big enough. You're not trusting God enough. There's nothing that's too big for God's power, nothing too small for God's heart. And so the first thing that we have to do when we want to step into this difference-making life, we have to seek God faithfully. We have to seek God faithfully. And if you're not doing that, today's a great day to start. The second thing that we're going to do if we want to make a real difference in life, to make a difference in our neighborhoods, to make a difference in our schools, our workplaces, our families even, we're going to have to define the vision clearly. Right? Like for most people, we want to step into something, we want to make a difference, we want to do something, and it's not the lack of care, it's not the lack of broken heart that's the problem. It's our lack of vision. It's our lack of clarity, right? Like if we want to make a difference, it starts by seeking God faithfully, but then it continues in defining a vision clearly. The king, right? The king asks Nehemiah, what can I do, or what do you want? Nehemiah, of course, prays, and then he says to the king in verse 4, if it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. Did you hear that? Like it was really clear. He gave him like a very clear vision statement. Send me to Judah so I can rebuild the city. It's clear. It's concise. Like the king doesn't have to wonder like, where's this guy going, right? Like he says, send me so that I can do this thing. He didn't say, well, you know what, king, like there's this thing that's out there. I was hoping maybe you would consider, King, I've really been thinking about it. Like, I heard some news, and I'd like to step into this, right? Like, he didn't start in this, like, wishy-washy place. He didn't send him a link to an article and be like, look what's happening over there. Like, it would be awesome if, like, we could do something about it. He didn't do that. He didn't say, hey, I'm going on a mission trip, but don't worry, I'll come back. Like, he didn't say that. He didn't say, like, oh, hey, King, I'm kind of getting tired of pouring your wine. Like, he didn't start there. He didn't say, I always wanted to travel, and this would be a great opportunity for me. He didn't send letters to people saying, hey, would you give to my adventure? No, he says, send me to Judah so I can rebuild the city. It's clear and it's concise. It's a clearly defined vision. Right? Like, it's not, for most of us, a lack of care. Like, we all have a lot of care for a lot of things, and we all have things that break our heart that we want to make a difference in. But that's not lacking. What's lacking is our clarity on, like, what do we do with that? It's lacking our vision on how to make that thing happen. So, what do you want to do? What's God calling you into? Do you want to help children? Like, you really want to help children? Like, great. That sounds awesome. But how do you want to help children? Which ones do you want to help, right? Like, you want to help all children? That's a lot of children. Children that don't have their basic needs? Children that can't read? Children that don't have homes, or maybe they're abused. Like, oh, and then they're like, where are you going to help these kids? Is that going to be far off? Somewhere that we can't, like, get to easily? Or is it going to be here locally? Is it going to be in our backyard? Is it going to be in your school? Like, where are you going to help? And then finally, like, what does help actually mean? Like, what does it mean? Does it mean that you're going to give them, like, medical attention, education? You're going to meet their needs? You're going to help them find homes? If you can't define it, if it's not clear and concise, you're not going to be able to do it, because people are just going to say, like, what's going on? Like, what are you trying to do? When we first started the church, I met with lots of different pastors, lots of different churches, and said, hey, we're starting a new church in Oak Creek. We'd love for you to be a partner in this. And what that meant is, can you help start us with a launch fund? Would you put some dollars into our launch fund so that we can have things like microphones and a place to rent, and maybe buy donuts and coffee so that when people come in on a Sunday morning, they're not as crabby when they leave, right? Like, we want to start a church in Oak Creek, and we'd love to invite you into that. And the questions I got were, well, how are you going to do that? What's it going to look like? Who's going to be there? Why are you doing this? And I realized pretty quickly that I didn't have a very clear vision. I just said, I want to help people. I want people to know Jesus. And over time, it turned into, well, we want to help people do life different. And doing life different looks like putting Jesus at the center of everything. It looks like putting Jesus at the center of our rhythms. That means schedules. And of our values, that means the things that we care about. If Jesus isn't at the center of our schedules or the things that we care about, are we really doing life different, or are we just doing life like everyone else around us? And as we nailed down on this, what doing life different looks like, and what setting rhythms and values with Jesus at the center looks like, churches and donors said, yeah, I want to be a part of that. Yeah, we want to help start this church in Oak Creek, and now we're here. In a sentence, what's God inviting you into? What's God leading you to do? What is God stirring up in you and saying, like, hey, you can make a difference in this way? Nehemiah says, send me to Judah so I can rebuild the city. Maybe for you, it's very specific, and you're saying, I want to lead my family to become totally debt-free by the end of 2024. Maybe it breaks your heart that you can't be generous because debt is so overwhelming. And this is a thing that, like, if I can do this, if God would allow me and my family to be debt-free, like, we could be generous We could support the church more. We could do things for our neighbors more. We could do things for people that are in need more. Or maybe you're a student and you're saying, like, I would love to have a personal conversation with each and every classmate before I graduate. And for some of you that are in like second grade, like my son JJ, like you got a lot of time to make that happen. But you also got a lot of people that you're hoping to have a conversation with. If you're about to be a senior in high school, you got a year. And it's going to take some praying to God for those opportunities to have those conversations. Maybe you're saying, like, I would love to donate $100,000 to my church in total before I'm 40. Like, I read this the other day, and somebody's like, things that you can do to be on mission with God. And I was like, man, I would love if, like, I could do that. I got a couple years left until I'm 40. My wife reminded me, though, how close that is just last night. Maybe for you have a heart for students, and you want to help teenage boys that are, maybe they're here at 1128, or maybe they live in the neighborhood around you. You want to help them overcome their porn addictions. Maybe they're not even teenage boys, because that creeps in earlier and earlier. Maybe you want to lead a group that gives married couples tools to heal and thrive. Like, I don't know what it is, but if you can't clearly define it and say, like, I'm going to do this, if you haven't prayed and spent time with God and gained that clarity, you're not going to be able to do it. If you can't define it, you can't do it. And if your vision isn't clear, people, they just can't follow or they won't follow, right? So it starts with seeking God faithfully, and then defining the vision clearly. Seek God faithfully, and then define the vision clearly. And then you're going to make plans carefully. Right? Like, the problem really is that without a plan, we're really just living out wishes. And some of us today, we're just wishing. Nehemiah Chapter 2, 6-8 says, Then the king, with the queen sitting beside him, asked me, How long will your journey take? And when will you get back? It pleased the king to send me. And so I set a time. I also said to him, If it pleases the king, may I have letters to the governors of Trans-Euphrates, so that they will provide me safe conduct until I arrive in Judah. He was asking for protection. And may I have a letter to Asaph, keeper of the royal park, so he will give me timber to make beams for the gates of the citadel by the temple, and for the city wall and the residences I will occupy. And because the gracious hand of my God was on me, the king granted my request, right? Like he asked for protection, letters, so as he traveled, he would have safety. And he asked for provision, the supplies to rebuild the city. He asked for protection, and he asked for provision. He asked for these things. The plan, it doesn't need to be perfect. You don't know how it's all going to work out in the end. The reality is, like, the plan never is perfect anyways. The plan will adjust and look different than you expected. But here's the thing. You can't get so hung up on the plan that you just get stuck. Like, the plan is good. Make plans carefully, but when in doubt, do the next right thing. Do the next right thing. Make your plans carefully, have it thought out, but in the moment, do the right thing. And the right thing will be clear when you're seeking God faithfully and have defined the vision clearly. Success, it's not the accomplishment that happens in the future. Success is the right thing today. Success isn't this far-off thing that you have to wait for. Success can happen today when you do the right thing because you've sought after God faithfully and you've defined the vision clearly. When you do that, you're going to be able to inspire people passionately. And inspired people are people that make a difference. Inspired people are the people that they step into it with you. They say, I'm all in. And I'll be honest, this next week, as we start to learn a little bit more about like what the inspired people look like, it gets a little hard. We're going to see opposition. We're going to see discouragement. We're going to see distraction. We're going to see fatigue. We're going to see people saying, like, is it worth it? Like, what's going on? Like, is this thing even possible? So make sure you're here next week for that discouraging message because I think it's going to speak to some of us. It's going to speak to some of us as we dream, as we seek God for how we can make a difference. Nehemiah 2:17-18 says, Then I said to them, this is him talking to people now, you see the trouble that we are in. Jerusalem, it lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we'll no longer be in disgrace. I also told them about the gracious hand of my God and on me and what the king had said to me. He inspired them. He told them about God and what God had done for them. But he told them, we will no longer be in disgrace. Inspired people have faith that God is for them. Inspired people have faith that God is with them. And inspired people have this empowerment within them that they can do something that matters. They could do something that really, truly, honestly makes a difference because our God is with us. And if we're not inspired, are we really going to make the kind of difference that God invites us into? John Wesley, the founder of the UMC, he had a lot of weird things to say. The UMC is the United Methodist Church. And one of the things he said that's a little bit weird at face value is, light yourself on fire with passion, and people will come from miles to watch you burn. When you're inspired, people will come. People will be drawn to that. They'll be inspired too. They might think you're crazy, but they're inspired. 2 years ago, June of 2021, we started meeting as a church for the very first time. We were meeting at Abendschein Park. I had to learn how to say Abendschein because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to say it, and I kept telling people, we're going to the park on Drexel, Abendschein Park. And some of you were there that day, our very first time meeting. There were 15 of us, 15 adults anyways, maybe 15 kids. That was our church. That's what church looked like for us at that time. And we had a dream of helping people do life different. We didn't know if it was going to turn out. We didn't know if people were going to join in and be a part of what was going on. We didn't know if lives would actually be changed or if we'd just be a group of 15 adults and 15 kids. But look what's happened over the last 2 years. There's about 160 people that call this their church now. That includes adults and kids, everything in between. There are 160 people in Oak Creek and the surrounding area that hopefully have been changed by God, transformed their hearts. Because there was a dream to help people do life different. And I hope and I dream that in the next 2 years, we'd see more people join up with what we're doing. That more people would say yes to doing life different. That more people would say, yes, I want Jesus at the center of my life. I want to have Jesus inform my rhythms and values. I'm tired of doing the same old thing over and over and over, but there's got to be something different. Like, my hope is that this thing would continue to grow. That we would seek God faithfully, create that vision that's just really clear, that we'd make plans that honor God. that our hearts would be moved and the hearts of people in our community would be moved, because that's what's going to change lives. What you care about, what we care about as a church, that burden, it's not an accident. Like, God's given us this burden so that we can go out and do something about it. And God's trusted us with a mission of helping people do life different in all different settings. And it's an assignment for us to live out. And so today, I want us just to leave here thinking about this burden that we bear. I want us to think about that. Think about what it is that really breaks our heart and allow it to reveal in us a calling to embrace, a mission, a difference-making opportunity. And then let's go out there and let's start living like God has done something in our lives and wants to do something in the lives of those around us as well. Let me pray for us as we step into this difference-making opportunity that's ahead. God, you've broken our hearts for something. Maybe it's helping people do life different. Maybe it's helping girls in prison. Maybe it's helping kids that don't have homes. God, the list could go on and on and on. But we know that what breaks our heart breaks yours as well. And would you give us the vision, the clarity? Would you give us the plans? Would you help us inspire people so that lives can be changed, a difference can be made? God, as we leave here this morning, help us to seek you faithfully. We pray this in your name. Amen.